Welcome to the window. It's what I threw my brain out of. The topic of this video is that every esports storyline is not exciting. And as a follow-up to that premise, and as always to link it to League of Legends in particular, my overall position is that not every storyline should be exciting. In competitive League of Legends, there is such a thing as a nothing game. There is such a thing as a filler game. And yet for some reason, Riot Games' journalism department over at lollysports.com feel the need to attempt to hype us up, to convince us that tuning into Team Liquid with 2 subs versus Team Echo Fox with 3 subs is worth the hour-plus period of time that it'll be on the broadcast. Now, as far as I'm concerned, there are 3 different types of games in any sport. But it's a bit easier to contextualize in esports, and specifically League has lots of easy examples I can give you right off the bat. So, the first kind of game is the game where, besides die-hard fans of, in their mind, underrated players, teams, or brands, nobody wants to tune in. So during the summer split of 2015 over in North America, a good example would have been the Week 2 match between Enemy Esports and Team Dragon Knights, or TDK. This was obviously when TDK had 2 subs in Latman and Smoothie, since Ninja and Emperor, the 2 of the team's strongest players, had visa issues that extended all the way to Week 5, Day 2 of the split. And so far, Enemy had been kind of underperforming for the little sample size we had in terms of games. They weren't exactly a team to watch out for. It was mostly a mix of unproven talent and really old fan favorites that had played the game in its early stages and had climbed the ladder, kind of grew some kind of streaming audience. Characters like Inox, Flares, Otter. So this was a pretty simple example of a nothing game. One team is weak in general, the other team is weak because of the fact that they have 2 substitutes. That's not always the case, though. Sometimes teams are just average, and the best example of this is actually the Week 1 showing of Vitality versus Rockhat. Both teams played pretty poorly. It wasn't the best team that won the match, it was more so the worst team lost it, and that kind of allowed the best, or the second worst team, I guess, to win. So you can see the way that I'm using the language there clearly defines that this isn't exactly like a marquee matchup. This wasn't a great game of League of Legends. It was average, or it was below average. It was a nothing game. It was a game that you didn't need to watch, and it was more so a game that you had incentives to not watch. Next, what we have is what Lolly Sports calls a BF game. I'll refer to this usually as marquee matchup, or using their terminology. This is more or less why we watch the regular season. It's when giants, not the EULCS team, metaphorical giants, not literal ones, they go head to head, they try to smash one another, and we want to see who comes out on top. More importantly, we want to see how they manage to one-up the other team. These games are typically once, maybe twice a broadcast. Usually they're separated, once a week, or rather once a day per week, and sometimes just separated week by week. Very rarely will you see a schedule where it's super concentrated, where you have like 2 or 3 BF games in, one, time span of 2 days, aka a week in LCS terms. A more recent example than, going all the way back to summer split of 2015 would be Energy versus Immortals in the past week of LCS. And over in Europe, we have another one of HTK versus Fnatic, both teams that were expected to be really strong and had shown that they could have, could lay claims to the throne, as it were, ended up going head-to-head. These are exciting games. And these are the ones you can hype out without sounding like a tool, or appearing to be less educated than you are, or just flat out lying or misrepresenting the data. The last of my trio of game descriptors lies between the nothing game and the BF game. It's a filler game. This is something I mentioned very early on in the video. This could be 2 very, very middle-of-the-pack teams like Week 1's Liquid versus Renegades in NA, where both teams had various difficulties and neither of them played like a winner until Renegades finally ended the goddamn game after an hour. of running back and forth. It could also be a stomp game with a clear favorite and a clear underdog who has almost no chance of winning, which is like H2K versus Rocket coming up pretty soon, or maybe it's already in the past, depending on what time you tuned into this video. These games are only as interesting as you yourself can make them. No article is going to do much to change how excited you are about seeing Forgiven go, 20-0 or something against the bottom lane of, I don't even know, Saphir and Edward on Rocket. So if you were to pick a single sentence to advertise a filler game, pretty much all the time it sounds like one of two pitches, if you will. And the first one would be, come watch this 60-minute clown fiesta where neither team really wins. Or I guess the second one would probably be something along the lines of, waiting for your low priority queue to tick down? Come watch a team get fucking demolished because they're relegation fodder and their opponents are favorites to win the entire league. I guess that last one wasn't exactly a single sentence, but you understand what I mean. Typically, these games don't really last too long on the broadcast, or they last too long. Either they don't last too long, or they last too long. And that's a pretty good rule of thumb when it comes to filler games, and these are reasons why we tend to avoid them as the average viewer. Either we have nothing better to do, so we watch them, or we just avoid them because we have no real reason for wanting to watch them, for wanting to experience that. Think about all the reasons, however, you have for watching marquee matchups. Just from watching the broadcast, you get the idea that even as like an average fan who maybe doesn't really keep up with the off-season moves or keep up with like what's going on in between weeks, in an ideal world, both teams are going to bring their A game. If they don't, it maybe is a fluke, or maybe one player is underperforming, and that in and of itself is an interesting storyline that is a real tangible storyline that you can create by just watching the game and having some analysis. And that's not even the starting assumption. You assume that both teams are going to go to the Rift to play some quality games of League of Legends. They're going to play to the best of their ability. They're going to execute strategies as best they can, maybe innovate with some new picks, or underused stratagems like poke comps or something in the current meta, where double AD or triple AD tends to take effect. Sometimes they'll go back to poke comps with the Varus mid that we weren't expecting, like what happened with Energy versus Immortals and over in Korea as well. And a lot of the times they try to just gain an upper hand just from the draft phase or from like an early level 1 or an unexpected lane swap or something along those lines. At the very least, they'll be using tried and true methods to attain victory, which means that it is just going to be an instance of you seeing something that maybe you've seen similarly or maybe even exactly the same way, but done better, done by an elite level team. This is in an ideal world this is the experience of watching a marquee matchup. So that's just from watching the broadcast with no outside experience whatsoever, no real incentive to look at like the players' streams or to really get invested in, what the players or what the teams or what the brands are doing outside of, the regular split. And now think of the average viewer. Maybe it's you. Maybe it's your buddies who are really interested in some of this stuff. They probably have Twitch accounts. They maybe have a favorite team or set of favorite players. And maybe your buddy's a top lane man. So he is going to go check out all of the leading top laners in all of the really good teams. And he's going to try to mimic what they're doing or see if maybe they found some pick that people weren't expecting. So maybe they go to Hanser's stream. And this is an example. I don't even think he streams all that often, but just off the top of my head, named a top laner who picked up, a champion that not too many other people have picked up, and it was Hanser's Poppy. Maybe he's playing Poppy on stream. Maybe your buddy, the top lane main, goes, that's pretty interesting. I'm going to try his build. Or maybe he watches a couple games and he's like, actually he's like building differently, situationally, and different responses. And maybe I wouldn't have thought of that item. Maybe Maw of Malmortius seems a little bit too offensive of a buy. Maybe I would have gone straight for like Banshee's Veil or something, but he's picking up Maw of Malmortius and he's crushing with it, so maybe I'll try it. Again, just an off the top of my head example of an instance where a fan will go and create their own storyline completely without looking at lolesports.com And here's where LoL Esports can facilitate additional hype and facilitate additional fire for that fan, for that average viewer, where they go and look at that Twitch stream, they go and see Haunter doing this crazy stuff with Poppy that they didn't particularly, on a personal level, think of beforehand. And they're like, all right, well, I'm going to go try that in my games. And then it maybe, you know, a day passes or 2 days pass, and it's getting close to the LCS, you know, debut of Haunter on Poppy, which was Immortals versus TSM, and that was in this past week. And he's going to go ahead and he's going to check out the schedule, and he sees like an article about Haunter and how influential he's been for TSM or something like that. Like, that's an example of a player who performed very well in the first 2 weeks of competition, and has essentially been a shining star for his team, where a lot of the other players kind of fell apart or underperformed, according to a lot of experts. And this is one example where you could very easily write an article about Haunter. Hell, there might be one on lolesports.com right now talking about how influential and how, you know, useful, essentially, and how efficient Haunter has been for TSM in their victories, and also in, you know, staving off defeat, even if it was inevitable. And this is one player on one team. Imagine how many viewers are interested in multiple players, multiple teams. Diehard fans of a single brand, like lots of the TSM fans, just off the top of my head. Once again, going back to TSM, they're the biggest esports org for a reason. They got lots of fans. They will be salivating over a marquee matchup with their favorite players on their favorite teams going head to head. That's how they really do cultivate regular readers on most of these sites that aren't lolesports.com, is that they offer a service which would be like seeing the schedule, and then they go ahead and also start writing editorials about how effective a certain person has been for a certain team or something along those lines. And then somebody who's a fan of that guy or a fan of that team will read that article, and if he agrees with it, or if it's entertaining to him in some manner, if it has learned, you know, given him new information to teach him a lesson of some kind, or anything at all, if anything is gleaned from this article, he will, that increases his chances of coming back for more than just looking at a schedule. And if lolesports.com is really trying to facilitate this kind of thing, then they should stray away from just providing needless and sometimes completely undeserved hype to nothing or filler games, and focus on what they can actually do without torturing and manipulating the stats or the actual truth of the matter, and the hard-boiled analysis of the games that have been played, and the players, if they have maybe not played a lot of games in this split, but they've played a lot in the previous, you know, instances or other regions or something where you do have a chance to analyze their play. You know, you could write an article about how Haunter looks pretty proactive. Maybe he's still adjusting, but he's playing really well. It's backed up by facts. You can't possibly expect to make a hype article about fucking Gate, where he's just this average mid player because he mains support, but so he plays safe, he plays TF, who can ult and affect the map, or utility champions like Lulu, who can just pile on for mash on AD carry. And now he's in the fucking top lane, so he's going to be playing FarmFest champions that also have some kind of global impact. Like, it was a miracle Gangplank got through the draft, but like Gangplank in that game versus, not Cloud9, but Renegades. Like, that's an example of a player you really, like, what are you going to write about? How he's just this, like, handyman that mains Phil? I mean, maybe that's kind of somewhat interesting to people who like laughing at players who are in really shitty situations, but that's not going to teach anybody anything. That's not going to offer anybody real, true entertainment on the basis of furthering their understanding of the game so that they can get more out of marquee matchups, and that they can understand maybe where one of their favorite teams or favorite players is actually underperforming, and they can see, like, wow, I really wish this guy would improve upon this. Like, they can actually contribute to some kind of discussion rather than just saying, hey, the article on LoL Esports says fucking Ica for Elements is the MVP of week 2 or whatever the fuck I just saw on the front page. And this guy is like, I'm waiting for him to turn back into a fucking pumpkin because he's on a team that is relegation fodder on paper and really hasn't been too convincing with the games that they have actually played. So this is an instance of a too good to be true situation in the case of Ica, where it's kind of like Cloud9 at Worlds going 3-0 the first day and then going 0-4 the second day. I mean, that's a really shitty spot for Cloud9, obviously, but they did turn back into the pumpkin. They did stop being so magical. So it was this weird fucking thing where everybody who was an actual legitimate expert, who actually understood the strength of the teams in that group, would have told you, yeah, Yamato Cannon wasn't wrong for saying that this, Cloud9 could potentially go 0-6 in the group. I mean, maybe he jumped the gun because he was trying to make a joke or something, but for the most part, that's not really incorrect analysis of the situation. And it creates this do-nothing atmosphere where you don't win over anybody, right? Because the experts who are well-informed and the viewers who are well-informed because they listen to those experts, like people who listen to Monte Cristo and who watch his content like on OGN Plus or whatever, as just an example, will know a lot more on average about the domestic strength of certain regions and also of the strength of their teams in a realistic sense, not in a hype sense. And those viewers, those fans, and those experts who are well informed will laugh repeatedly and sometimes vitriolically at the reporting of LoL esports. And the less informed individuals who buy into that hype are left with a sour taste in their mouth when that hype is inevitably never fully realized. When they do turn back into the pumpkin, as I continuously keep saying. And I just want to underscore how important that is. Where you get people, they get the odd case where maybe a team that should have been relegation fodder on paper somehow manages to retain their LCS spot. But if you're talking about hyping up this team like Elements was in the spring split of 2015, I mean, these guys were a super team on paper, and they absolutely fell apart. And there was so much hype going into that split about this team. This is a great example of exactly what I'm talking about, where all of the people who signed up to be fans of Elements and cheered for those players because it was a super team, and they kept throwing that word around. I mean, they were absolutely disappointed. And if the atmosphere hadn't been this do-nothing area where the more well-informed people who may have been guilty of falling for that hype at that moment because the roster did look so good on paper, are going to be a bit more dubious when it comes to big name brands like TSM and Alliance rebranding as Elements and all this other stuff, forming these quote-unquote super teams. They're going to wait until they see results before they do anything, and they're not going to go and look at the LoL esports articles because that's not going to tell them anything that they don't already know. It's not going to inform them of any new developments that might actually impact the outcomes of games. Now, I should mention that when it comes to best of ones, you typically won't be consuming too much time. If it's a stomp of a game, it'll end the whole affair pretty quickly. At most, you lose about an hour of your time. And that's only if you bother to stick with the broadcast the whole way through. If you're really invested in the brand, despite it being average, below average, underperforming, whatever, maybe you stick around the whole time. Or you tune in real quick, you see that a game is not really that interesting, or you find out that, surprise, the whole team is like a substitute roster or whatever, so that star import player, cough cough Froggen, that you followed from when he was performing in his home region, isn't even playing in that game, so you take off and go back doing whatever you're doing before. Unfortunately, this is obviously not going to stay this way. I mean, Riot's already announced that they plan on making a move to best of 3s in NA, best of 2s in Europe, so these are longer series. That means that they have to move on to simultaneous broadcasts in order to fit every series due to whatever logistic reasons they happen to be having. They don't want to, keep, or either they don't have rights to broadcast super late, or they don't want to for the viewership reasons, or maybe they don't have the money to pay their staff or whatever. I don't think that last potential excuse is a valid excuse, since Riot's this multi-billion-dollar company or whatever. But there are a couple of logistics issues that could explain why they need to do simultaneous broadcasts, and I'm totally for simultaneous broadcasts unless they go the route that I think they might go based on their track record. The historic approach that Riot has had to hype up every game as if HTK versus Fnatic is equivalent in any way to Elements versus Rocket or whatever, is going to be very problematic. It could cause a lot of issues for the viewers, the journalists, the broadcast crew, the experts that aren't on the analyst desk, anyone I've left out that falls into this whole complex of actually analyzing the game or casting the game or watching the broadcast more specifically. Riot loves storylines. And this is So this is true insofar as they are willing to pull out all the stops to declare what they call a BF game for every region every week on PTL. And they feel compelled to schedule these marquee matchups every single week in every competitive region. That might not impact best of ones because they're short and you can fit them all into one broadcast. But it certainly could impact the broadcasting times of the longer series. We might have a case where TSM versus Immortals is going to go on at the same time as Energy versus CLG, or whoever rounds up top 4. You would think that Riot would understand the significance of marquee matchups, and I would agree with you if this whole off-season nonsense with Korea and the broadcasting rights to that whole league hadn't happened. It's clear that their supposed understanding of viewer retention and of who's going to watch what really attracts a fan or a viewer to a broadcast, it's not necessarily as sound as we would have liked to believe. And here's why. I'm going to contextualize the similarities between this eventual split broadcast of Korean games of League of Legends and the eventual split broadcast of the LCS regions. And in order to do that, I have to give you an overview of what Riot plans to do with the LCK in summer and bring it back to what's happening in the LCS regions, because otherwise, for people who don't know, they're not going to understand the connection, and even people who do know might not see the connection immediately. So just to cover all our bases, let's talk about this. Riot has partnered with SPO TV, and this is a free-to-air broadcaster. And free-to-air means that if you have anything that can connect to the internet, smart TV, cable box plugged into a modem, computer, tablet, laptop, anything, it can view the broadcast. It can receive it. And this is in an attempt to widen the audience of both domestic and foreign viewers of the OGN games. So SPO TV will, as of the summer season of Champions Korea, have the rights to broadcast the games. And the games will also be played in 2 separate studios, which adds an extra level of overcomplication, where an empty studio with no fans and just the broadcast crew will be casting the game, while the actual game is played physically in a different studio entirely. So if the games are being played in the OGN studio, then the SPO TV studio will be empty besides the casters. And vice versa, if it's being played in the SPO TV studio. This is true despite the fact that the OGN studio has 2 fucking studios inside it. So this is how insane this is. Like, OGN could do simultaneous broadcasts if that's something that Riot wanted to do, and instead they have to license it off to SPO TV for their ham-fisted bullshit reasons. And this is why it's bullshit, because anybody who knows anything about the foreign broadcast, which is English-speaking broadcast, where it's not domestic, it's not the Korean-centered broadcast. The ones that are broadcast from the OGN studio themselves are going to be Monte Cristo, Doa, and Papa Smithy. And for the most part, these guys are the faces of English-speaking Champions games. These guys are entertaining, they are informative, they do a great job of casting the games in a clever and witty manner. It tends to keep people coming back for more. They make jokes, they're lighthearted about it, and they're still hype when they need to be hype. There's not this, overflowing, love for all teams or whatever that LoL Esports seems to, kind of try to procreate or perpetrate, rather. But you will see, Papa Smithy and Monte Cristo talk about something like, maybe Samsung Galaxy is underperforming back in last split, or Spenu, which really, I don't think they won a single best of X. Maybe they won 1 or something. So just out of virtue of them playing in a game, they would manage their expectations and the fans as well. They wouldn't be saying we expect flashy plays, or they wouldn't even give you that subtle tacit expectation by the way that their tone of voice was. They would treat it like the filler game that it was. They would cast it because that's their job, and that's totally, fine. They would entertain people who were looking for them in particular, the casting personalities, or were diehard fans of the particular teams or the particular players. Or if it was like SKT versus Spenu, then obviously it was going to be like a stomp game or something like that. Then maybe they watch it for that, that entertainment value or something along those lines. But they don't watch it with the expectation of the game being really good and of it being really hypey, and of them sitting here I can't wait to watch this game of League of Legends. It's going to be great. Now, in this vein of entertainment, OGN has a stranglehold over the Korean scene. And there's a reason why they have worked so hard to get that kind of lion's share of viewers. SPO TV is going to be a clear underdog compared to OGN, who are the clear favorites in terms of who's going to like watch who and who's going to win, you know, so to speak, to kind of bring it back to the idea of a storyline, right? This is a storyline of Riot attempting to facilitate an underdog to compete at the same level, in this case, compete for the prize of viewership and the prize of like loyal viewership that comes back to them. You know, you're not going to get that versus OGN. Like in this case, it's like SKT versus Spenu. It's like you know, SKT versus the Bangkok Titans at Worlds. Like, you do not expect anything but utter domination when it comes to the, you know, who wins, who comes out on top. And in this case, OGN will come out on top. There's no questions asked. And SPO TV isn't going to be attractive for the domestic Korean fans because OGN already broadcasts it in very high quality. They've got really, really high quality public or production value. And they also have really strong casting talent in both the domestic broadcast and the English-speaking one as well. So there's no way that viewers are going to be flocking towards SPO TV because they've been dying for another option. I mean, OGN has broadcasted it very, very well in a very satisfactory manner, and they've been the only one doing it. So this is not something that it's like there was a need for a higher standard of broadcasting quality, and Riot has stepped in to provide that. That is not the case at all. They are just trying to create a story, not a storyline, but they're trying to facilitate what is essentially an underdog, and it's a David versus Goliath story, if I ever heard one, where, in this case, David gets utterly crushed in the end. Spoiler. So, it's this kind of short-sightedness that could realistically extend to the premier LCS regions as well. If Riot can't differentiate between the obvious underdog and the obvious favorite in something as tangible and quantifiable through numerical value as a casting crew for their own game and how many viewers that drags in, can they seriously be expected to comprehend the differences between a marquee matchup and a nothing game? And obviously, you know, between Riot Korea's offices and the offices of the LCS regions, the staff are obviously different. Maybe they have some behind the scenes thinking that also differs when you go region to region. Perhaps, you know, they won't be as short-sighted as I'm making them out to be, or as I personally believe they could be. But judging by their track record, as I've elucidated so far, the future is not really that hopeful. The future could very well be filled with a double broadcast of nothing games and then a double broadcast of BF games where nobody wants to watch the first two and everyone wants to tune into the second two, but they have to pick and choose because of the way that the broadcast worked out. Just on the basis of the fact that Riot just loves hyping up every single game as if they were all equal, and they're not. And not every storyline is exciting. I mean, that's not a future I want to see come to fruition. Trust me. I hope Riot gets their shit together. I hope they realizes that not every game that is played at a competitive level is a good game of League of Legends. And in fact, if we're honest, most games are actually not good games of League of Legends. They're not games between two teams that have distinctive or even effective styles and star carry players that everybody wants to watch go nuts and get crazy fucking KDAs and rake in the fantasy points and all this other stuff. You know, if they can manage to arrive at the somehow uncommon conclusion that the average viewer kind of creates their own story and they find their experience more enjoyable, which is really crucial here, when they can create their own story, their own storylines, in order to follow the rise and the fall of any player they want. And that their personal favorite, right? And any team as well, their personal favorite team, without having to stomach the unfortunate sight of their team turning back into the pumpkin. That it always really was, and always, you know, most people will be able to see through that. Most people who are well-informed and are experts or follow experts. And maybe we can have less cringeworthy reporting on lolesports.com that facilitates this kind of environment where a lot of fans are unfortunately buying into the hype and then feeling pretty cheated by, when their team just underperforms, even though that should have been expected. And that should also be part of the atmosphere, is that middling teams and underperforming teams, they will not do well. And hey, maybe I can get hired at lolesports.com and make some real money. That's all for today. Toss me a like or some shit. I'll see you later.